More citizen testimony at City Hall.
The other board that I am concerned about is the Education Consortium. It basically, in my understanding, does not have an educator on that board. I did apply in 2008. I'm a former teacher of the year, and I don't see any black educators or educators in particular. I understand from Candy Parham that that board is basically dormant. So I would ask you to consider that education is an economic issue and it is very important, and that there does need to be an educator, and preferably at least a black educator on that commission. And if you have...
Now, Zenobia, tell us, what is the Texas Urban Renewal Law?
Well, the Texas Urban Renewal Law is actually Local Government Code, Chapter 374, and it's one of those laws that's been on the books over 50 years. So it was enacted in 1957, House Bill 70, and the intent was to clear up slums and blighted areas in specific areas within cities. So slums, if you think of slums, it's just the safety, morals, and things that contribute to juvenile delinquency. And when you think of blighted areas, you can think of the two B's, BB, so that's for the buildings. So blighted areas are deteriorating structures and buildings. In other words, it's Austin's eyesore. So in 1957, the Texas legislature enacted urban renewal law. But in order for a city to receive funding and to enact the language that was proposed in the statute, they had to hold a local election. And here in Austin, that election was held December 5th, 1959. So 52 years ago, by a margin of 52 votes, the citizens of Austin who owned real property decided that they wanted this urban renewal. They wanted to clean up the areas that were east of East Avenue, which is really I-35 today. And so it was like 11th Street, 12th Street, Chicon, those areas that are still not so much today because of gentrification, but for the most part have been the eyesores of Austin. And it really goes back in time to 1928 to the Negro District, which was the city plan that created the district east of East Avenue, which is, of course, I-35, and also the south part of Interstate 35, which is where the cemetery was located.
So it sounds like government had a specific role in determining where black citizens in Austin could live.
Exactly. So one of the things that, of course, citizens could live wherever they wanted to, but this specific city plan incentivized the black citizens to live east of I-35 in order to get utilities and things that they needed for basic living. And you can see the racial tensions, and you can see how Austin was back then. And for many citizens who ask the question, why are we always talking about race? Haven't we moved on? The question that they're asking needs to be contextualized with the Voting Rights Act and redistricting, and to understand that these laws are still on the books. So race may be dormant, but it's never dead.
Yeah, we have a black president. Racism is totally gone in this country. Didn't you get the memo? Once Obama was elected, all racism and all racist laws and all past laws that were discriminatory, those all just evaporated.
You know, I really would like to believe that. And one of the matter is that the issue regarding race and redistricting is tied to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And because Texas is what's called a covered jurisdiction, that means that Texas is actually going to receive oversight by the federal government. So the Department of Justice actually, in other words, protects citizens of color to ensure that their rights as it relates to voting and redistricting aren't jeopardized.
Real quickly, listener, if you're not familiar, redistricting is basically when our elected officials decide what the boundaries are going to be for voting districts. They do this every 10 years at the state and federal level. This was one of the big issues at the state government in Texas. So over the last 10 years, the Latino population has greatly increased, and Democrats wanted there to be more Latino districts where they knew Latinos lived. They would most likely elect a Latino representative. I think the estimate was there should have been 10 extra, and the Republicans sliced up the districts so that Latinos only got about 3 more districts. So redistricting is a very political issue. Who gets to divide them up and how you split communities. For example, Austin was split in a way that tried to prevent Lloyd Doggett, who is the federal representative in Congress for Austin, tried to prevent him from getting elected. Because Austin's a very liberal city. They most likely would elect a Democrat. But the Republicans in office tried to slice up Austin so that he wouldn't get elected and basically dilute the liberal vote of Austin with larger communities like Dallas and Houston and San Antonio. So, Zenobia, you're telling me that there's a history of redistricting, I don't want to say fraud, but basically gerrymandering of black voters and black citizens in Austin?
Well, it's not necessarily just black voters. It's actually the creation of majority-minority districts. So there's been litigation, if you will, over the years, and incumbency protection and racial gerrymandering is nothing new. It's one of those things that representatives do when they want to consider, how will I get reelected? But again, the Voting Rights Act actually protects the minorities so that they can actually elect representatives of their choice. And so you may have seen in today's newspaper the issue regarding Lloyd Doggett's redistricting issue, and that issue is actually going to court as we speak, so to say.
What does the Voting Rights Act say? How does that protect minority voters?
Well, they're protected in a sense that there has to be, I guess the easiest way to explain it is a cluster of minorities, a certain percentage of them. So I think you have to think about the history of voting. Minorities at one point were disenfranchised, and blacks in particular were not able to register to vote, and so they weren't able to select those people that they wanted to represent them, the elected officials. So what the Voting Rights Act does is still protects these clusters, if you will, of African Americans and Latinos. And so some of the two cases I'll mention, one is Vera against Bush, 1996, and then there was also the League of Latin American Citizens against Perry in 2006. And in these cases, the issue was majority-minority districts. So when you look at racial gerrymandering, it's not necessarily just blacks, but it's minorities. And the other thing to consider, too, is that for Latinos and people who speak English as a second language, the Voting Rights Act actually protects them in the sense that they get their ballots in a language other than English. And so without that discussion about race that we don't like to have, I think if citizens in Texas, especially the Latino population, realizes that, hey, if not for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you might be told, hey, English is the way to go in America and you just have to speak the language.
So what were the rulings of, the Perry case and the Bush case here in Texas? What happened with those?
Basically, the citizens prevailed, if you will. But the bottom line is that there were some constitutional issues that were decided in one of the cases, and the Texas legislature, the way that they drew the lines, it didn't quite mesh with what had been done historically. So in other words, you could use the computer to sort of generate these districts, but once you water down the districts too much and there's not a majority-minority population, then that becomes suspect. So in other words, the citizens prevailed. So
basically the minorities that were getting pushed around by the redistricting, they won both against, I guess that was George W. Bush, Governor George W. Bush, and then Governor Rick Perry just 5 years ago.
Right, 2006.
So tell me, why did you get involved with the Texas Urban Renewal Law?
Well, that's a really good question. I was reading the newspaper, and actually there's a local paper, it's called NOCOA, and I was doing some editing.
How do you spell that?
NOKOA. So it's a newspaper that's been around for, over 20 years, so since 1987, and the editor actually stated that he needed some help, so I thought I can do this. Well, I'm not from Texas, so I know it's a little odd, I'm African American, but...
Not from Texas? You better just get out of here.
So I was looking at this information, and it said Urban Renewal Board. And as a citizen, I thought, oh, they're the decision makers. That's who I should have paid attention to. So I then researched to see what does the Urban Renewal Board do. Well, this was on or about June 20th. They were supposed to have a meeting. It was canceled. The previous meeting was canceled too, and I thought, is this a pattern? So the bottom line...
2 cancellations in a row?
Well, one of the things is that they didn't have a quorum, so they couldn't meet. Open government and the Open Government Act and things of that sort. So I then started to pay attention, and they had 3 board openings at the time. And one of the little blurbs that I saw online by KXAN actually said that you had to be an Austin citizen and you had to own real property. And all I asked was, why is that?
Wow, that reminds me like pre-Civil War, where you had to own property to vote. Right?
Exactly. And the thing, if you go back in time, the December 5th, 1959 election, in order to be a qualified voter, you had to own property. If you think back to 1959...
That's it? Just 60 years ago?
Exactly. And you know who owned property back then? Think about 1928 in the Negro District and the city plan.
So probably rich white people owned property.
Absolutely. So there was contention. Don't get me wrong. There were people who owned property who fought this battle about urban renewal for 3 years. This case was litigated. But still, it wasn't people of color primarily who owned property. And so fast forward to 2011, you still have to own property to be on the board. But think about it. November 2006, there was a bond election. This bond election was for citizens to approve minority facilities for the Asians, Hispanics, and the African Americans. So the African Americans got about $1.5 million, but all citizens in Austin were able to vote in that election. But all citizens in Austin are permitted to be on the board because of this state law, which I say needs to be repealed. And the specific language is in section 374.023 of the local government code.
374.023. Wow, someone's done her homework. That's just amazing to me that you would need to own property in order to vote or in order to serve a certain position. I mean, not everyone thinks real estate's a good investment. I mean, just look at what happened over the last 3 years. Everywhere pretty much but Texas, the real estate has gone down. And in places like California and Florida, it's plummeted. And if you're not a landowner, you're not allowed to vote. Prior to 1959, you're allowed to vote. You're not allowed to be on these boards that exercise power over where funds for the community goes. That's just ridiculous to me. It's like the medieval times here.
But you know what? The Supreme Court actually agreed with you.
The Supreme Court did something I liked?
I think
wow,
so.
That's very unusual.
Right. So in Supreme Court held Texas state law was unconstitutional, and that they could not condition property as a condition for voting. And so the question becomes, what if you can't use property as a condition for voting? Why can you use property as a condition to be on a board that will clear out slums and blighted areas in your neighborhood?
Yeah. We don't want people that might live in the slums to be on those boards. That would be terrible. We only need the landowners who own those slums. That's who we want involved in cleaning up the slums, right?
Exactly. And you know what really got me impassioned about? This was one of the projects that I actually finished quickly. And I did send my information to the Department of Justice, and I recommended that they sue the state of Texas. I'm a citizen. Whether they'll actually take me up on the offer, I don't know, but I did my part. But I tell you, it was so compelling to me. June 23rd, 2011, the city council meeting, there were citizens, literally Hispanic citizens, arguing about F1 development, which you've covered here on the station before, and they were actually concerned about their neighborhoods. Some of these citizens were there until 11:37 p.m. when the meeting ended, and some of these citizens were renters. They were the passionate people who were there, and many of those citizens can't be on a board to determine things that impact their daily lives. And I just thought it was wrong. So that's one of the reasons why I also brought it to the city council members' attention yesterday.